What happens when a successful PlayStation exclusive developer walks away from his publisher? ShiftUp may consider self-publishing future titles instead of relying on Sony. For years Sony funded the game, marketed, and secured exclusivity for the PlayStation platform. But if the developer steps away from the arrangement, it would signal something important happening across the games industry. Understanding why requires looking at how publishing deals work and how successful studios change their strategy after a hit. Most people assume publishers only help with marketing. The reality is much broader. Publishing deals exist because building a major game requires resources that most studios do not have on their own. Funding is the first reason. A high-end action game like Stellar Blade can cost tens of millions of dollars to produce. Publishers like Sony provide that capital up front. In exchange, they receive a large portion of revenue and control over distribution decisions. Marketing and platform support come next. Sony's publishing system gives a game access to large advertising campaigns, placement in PlayStation showcases, and storefront promotion. This visibility matters because thousands of games launch every year. Even strong games struggle to break through without platform support. There is also risk management. If a game fails, the publisher absorbs much of the financial damage. For smaller studios, this safety net makes development possible. This is why many developers begin their careers with publisher partnerships rather than operating independently. However, success changes the equation. When a game performs well, the studio gains recognition. Its negotiating power increases. That shift is where new strategies begin to appear. A studio that proves it can produce a hit game gains leverage. Instead of depending on a publisher to fund the next project, it can explore other options. One major incentive is revenue control. Publishing agreements often give the publisher a large percentage of profits. If a developer self-publishes, it keeps far more of the revenue generated by the game. The difference becomes significant when a title sells millions of copies. Another factor is platform flexibility. When Sony publishes a game, it launches on PlayStation. A self-published studio can release the game across multiple platforms, including PC and other consoles, for example. That strategy can expand the audience. And there is also brand ownership. Studios that self-publish maintain stronger control over their intellectual property. This matters for sequels, merchandise, film adaptations, and long-term franchise development. These incentives explain why several modern studios move towards independence after their first major success. The industry has seen this pattern many times. A developer that begins with publisher backing, builds a reputation, and later shifts to controlling its own projects. If ShiftUp follows its path after Stellar Blade, it would fit an established pattern rather than an unusual decision. This situation highlights several changes happening across the game business. First, successful studios now have more publishing options than they did in the past. Digital storefronts such as Steam allow developers to reach players directly without relying on traditional publishing channels. This infrastructure makes independence more realistic than it was a decade ago. Second, platform exclusivity is becoming more complicated. Companies like Sony continue to pursue exclusive titles because they drive console sales. Developers often want their games available across as many platforms as possible. These goals do not always align. As developers gain financial strength, they can negotiate shorter exclusivity periods or avoid them entirely, which I think that's what most of them want anyway. Third, global developers are gaining more influence. Studios outside of North America and Japan can now produce some of the most successful games in the industry. ShiftUp is part of a growing group of Korean and Chinese developers entering the global console market. These studios are often backed by strong domestic investment, what gives them additional independence when negotiating with Western publishers. Fourth, the balance of power between developers and publishers is changing. Publishers often control distribution and marketing channels. Digital platforms, social media marketing, and direct community engagement now give studios alternative ways to promote their games. this reduces the need for traditional publishing structures in some cases. Now, several practical factors can influence a decision like this to go more independent. The most obvious is financial performance. If Stellar Blade sells strongly, the studio gains capital and confidence to fund future projects itself. Another factor is global demand for the studio's work. A developer that proves that it can attract international audiences becomes more valuable and less dependent on one publisher. There is also long-term strategic control. Studios that self-publish can plan sequels, expansions, and spin-offs with no need for approval from a publishing partner. That control becomes more important when the studio is building a multi-game franchise. Finally, competition among publishers can also shift negotiations. If multiple companies want to work with a studio, the developer gains stronger bargaining power and more options. If a studio behind a major PlayStation title eventually moves towards self-publishing, it reflects a large industry trend. Developers who produce successful games are increasingly choosing greater control over their distribution, platforms, and intellectual property. Publishers still play an important role, especially in funding and marketing large projects, but the relationship between studios and publishers is evolving. More developers now see publishing partnerships as a starting point rather than a permanent arrangement. For companies like shiftup, the decision will probably come down to one question: does long-term independence offer more value than continued partnership with a major publisher? The answer to that question will shape not only the future of Stellar Blade, but also how the next generation of developers approaches publishing deals. Overall, though, I think this is more of a good change.